This is the Germans from Russia Experience, Episode 10, The Great Lawrence Welk with Michael Miller. Welcome to the Germans from Russia Experience. I am the creator and your host, Elisa Long Rodriguez, and I am here to inspire you and others to learn anything and everything about your own family heritage by providing information, experiences, and stories about a special group of people, the Germans from Russia. Hello everyone, I am Elisa, and today I will be sharing with you a conversation I had with Michael Miller. Michael is the Emeritus Director of the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection at North Dakota State University Libraries. He is the President of the Friends of the Welk Homestead and also Tri-County Tourism Alliance historian. Although Michael is officially retired from his position at North Dakota State University, in which he worked nearly 55 years, he continues to work preserving and promoting the heritage of Germans from Russia through his work as the producer of 11 PBS documentaries highlighting our Germans from Russia heritage through Prairie Public Television. He writes a monthly column for In Touch with Prairie Living, and he continues to support, promote, and preserve the Lawrence Welk Homestead, among many other activities relating to the Germans from Russia heritage. You will understand just how absorbed he is in the Germans from Russia community when I tell him a little story at the beginning of our conversation. Enjoy. Good morning, Michael. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great. I want to start off with just a teeny tiny story. A few weeks ago, I was with some friends and somebody I haven't seen in a while, and he had out his phone, and the other friend was telling him that I had a podcast, and he said, "Oh, I have," and he was talking about his AI app on his phone and stuff, and I said, "Oh, ask it if there's a podcast about Germans from Russia." And so he asked his AI, "Is there a podcast for Germans from Russia?" And she said, "Yes, it's called the Germans from Russia Experience." And then he asked it, "Well, who made the podcast?" And it gave the names of my artwork, person who did my artwork, Matt Wall, and Annie Anderson, who is my producer friend who she helps me put it up online. And then he asked, "Well, who is the creator of this podcast?" And it said, "Michael Miller."
Oh,
Everyone was like, "Who's Michael Miller?" And I said, "Oh, he's this big celebrity in the Germans from Russia education world." And I explained who you were. So isn't that cool that your name is out there so
small
heavily
world. Yes, yeah.
that AI thought you were the creator of my podcast?
Interesting.
Okay, great. So today you have some things that are coming up to share about the Lawrence Welk, history of Lawrence Welk.
Well, I'll give you a little background about myself, why I
Sure.
know the name Lawrence Welk. I grew up in Strasburg, North Dakota, and the Welk Homestead, or the Welk Homestead State Historic Site, is near Strasburg, which is in south central North Dakota. And so it was established in the 1980s. It was restored by Pioneer Heritage. Then in July 1st, 2015, the State Historic Society of North Dakota became the owners of the 6 acres on the Welk Homestead. So it's now a state historic site. The North Dakota legislature provided funding to purchase the 6 acres, which includes the farmstead and the house where Lawrence Welk was born. And so the 10th anniversary of the Welk Homestead will be actually in July of 2025 with some rather big events. But growing up in Strasbourg, of course, we would know about Lawrence Welk. And I remember one example in 1960 when Lawrence Welk was in North Dakota with one of his concert tours. He came to Strasbourg, and I was a junior in high school, and he actually came and he was there for the homecoming and the crowning of the homecoming queen,
Oh,
which was
wow.
quite a big event. And I'll never forget that because Johnny Klein, who was the drummer of the Lawrence Welk Show for 25 years, who was from Strasbourg, and Mike Dosh, a famous accordionist who was in KFYR television in Bismarck, and so they all performed there at the concert. So you can imagine what kind of attendance we had, and a memorable homecoming to have the famous Lawrence Welk and my cousin Johnny Klein and Mike Dosh all performing on stage with the crowning of the Queen. So that was
Wow.
quite an event. I'll never forget that. And there's
Yeah.
pictures of that. And it became quite an important event in the history of Lawrence Welk. But growing up, my one of Lawrence Welk's sisters, Agatha Welk Turnus, lived across the street from us. And then we had down the street was Mary Anna Mary Welk Mattern, who was also a sister. So I got to know them, and Anna Mary and Agatha were very good friends with my mother, and they really never learned good English. So I was fortunate because I could speak good German. I grew up speaking German, and fortunately, I can still speak pretty good German today. And so that was very helpful. And even when Lawrence Welk would come home to visit, um, his sisters would speak English, but I remember that they sometimes speak German. Lawrence Welk could still understand German, but he'd answer back in English.
Oh, you had to
So
have a lot of
that was
practice
very
by
touching
then.
for me. And then later on, um, when Lawrence Welk was born in 1903, and he was at the homestead until 1924, so he was 21 years old,
Mhm.
and then he left the homestead because his father bought him a $400 accordion, which was very expensive, but he
All
had to
right.
pay that back.
Yes.
And so it's quite an interesting history about him leaving in 1924. And then and when he was a teenager and so forth, he would play a lot of band. He would play in bands around, play the accordion around Strasbourg and into South Dakota, and that's
Hmm.
how he made some extra money.
Yes.
So then, but I think really in the era of Lawrence Welk, really his fame started when he went to Yankton, South Dakota, and that's when he started performing on WNEX radio, which
Uh-huh.
is in southeastern South Dakota. Really made his fame. He became famous. Then he went on, and he had the Hotsy Totsy band. He went on to Chicago and so forth. But all of this will appear in a new 3-volume biography of Lawrence Welk, which North Dakota State University Press is going to publish, and it's going to premiere on May 31st, 2025, at the Heritage Center Bismarck, because Dr. Lance Ritchie is writing the book, and so that's going to become available then. And at the same time, on May 31st at the Heritage Center Bismarck will be the world premiere of the new documentary on the Welk homestead. That's being produced by Prairie Public Broadcasting. And that's actually going to be the 11th documentary of the Germans from Russia series.
Oh, I was
It's
wondering how many there were.
legendary.
Yeah.
So that'll be in May 31st, 2025. So at that so that's going to be a big day at the Heritage Center in Bismarck because it'll be the premiere of the documentary, and it also will be the unveiling of the new book on the
Oh, wow.
three-volume set. And that the um, the book is going to be hopefully will become a premium item for PBS stations throughout the United States. Prairie
Mhm.
Public will first broadcast the documentary for this part of the United States in probably in June of 2025, and then it'll become later on other PBS stations, and then the book will eventually become available. But to begin with, The book will only be available as a premium item for PBS stations. Later, people can order it, but it's going to be a beautiful set. And I've done reviewing of each chapter as the book
Oh.
was being done. And I'd have to say it's probably the most comprehensive and well done biography of a television entertainer.
Mm.
Because Lawrence Welk was, I think it was 27 years he was on television, and still he's on PBS stations. So he's really quite a legacy. And
Mm-hmm.
probably in our Germans from Russia community, he's probably the most famous Germans from Russia in North America, and
Yeah.
even could be worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be quite important.
Yeah.
Then on June 1st, Sunday, June 1st, 2025, at the Welk Homestead, will be another big event, and that's going to be an unveiling of a life-size bronze statue of Lawrence Welk.
Oh, great.
And that's going to be there. It'll be quite a nice attraction for tourism at the
Mm-hmm.
homestead. And the statue was once at the Lawrence Welk Theater at Branson, Missouri, but the family has decided, because the theater is no longer existing there, so they have decided through the family to donate it to the Friends of the Welk Homestead, which will be at the Welk Homestead, and I serve as president of the Welk Homestead. So we're real thrilled that that's going to be happening. That's going to be a big event at the homestead.
Wow. I wish I was closer.
Oh
I would
yes.
take part.
Well, you'll have to make a trip back to come visit back home in North Dakota, and you can come
Yeah.
and see it. It's
Yeah.
quite a beautiful event. Um, the 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 Welk Homestead State Historic Site is the only state site in North Dakota that focuses on farming and homesteading.
Mm.
And that's very important. So the documentary that's going to be produced, that is only about Lawrence Welk and his fame as a band leader, but also relating to the Homestead Act of 1862. And
Mm-hmm.
it also relates to farming, rural life, and agriculture. I think that's very important because had it not been for Lawrence Welk growing up, at the homestead, and he was surrounded by, first of all, his father was a musician, and there were other musicians in Strasbourg. It had not been for him taking lessons from some of these people, Lawrence probably would never have gained his fame or become such a famous accordionist, because he he had very little education. He only finished up to the third grade. He never went to even to finished grade school.
Right. I was wondering about that because in the research that I did when it said that he didn't start speaking English till after he left his home when he was 21, I thought, well, didn't they go to school? But yeah, that would make sense then if they only went to
Because it was such a prominent Catholic community, and German was so, in the because he left in 1924, so in the 1920s and 30s and even to the 40s, very little English was spoken. So I grew up. That's why I grew up
Mhm.
speaking German and English, because at home we would do, we probably would be a mixture of both German and English. But when I went to school, I didn't have a problem with. Some of the children had problem with school, especially in the 20s and 30s in the country schools, because they didn't in the Dakotas, their first language was German. So some of the children didn't know until they were in the probably in the first grade
Mhm.
that they learned the language. But and that probably was also true in our Volga German community, and in Nebraska and Kansas too, where the early years where they had that, and it was prominent. But a lot of it had to do with their parents didn't know the English language. They never, because Lawrence Welk's parents, I have a feeling, really never learned to speak much English.
Yeah, yeah. And the isolation too. I mean, they were still kind of isolated if they were out on these
Very isolated, yes.
multi-acre farms.
And so fortunately, Lawrence was very lucky because, first of all, his father agreed to buy this $400 accordion, and he had to pay it off. And a lot of it, the way he paid it off was he would go out, and he would, as a teenager, he'd go down to Eureka, South Dakota. They'd go all over and they'd perform. And
Mhm.
so he made some good extra dollars doing that. And yeah, there's some wonderful stories about him in fact, my March column of In Touch with Prairie Living that I do is going to focus on it's the I think it's the 122nd anniversary of Lawrence Welk's birthday.
Okay.
So it talks about in there. It talks about a collection that we have from Verna Fisher Green, who grew up in Hague, North Dakota, and her father was the postmaster, but he also was a musician. And he would, in the 1920s, he would he would pick up Lawrence Welk, who had come from Aberdeen and Roscoe, South Dakota, on the train, and then they'd perform together. That's a wonderful story about that. So he
Mhm.
went on in the early years, and of course, an interesting story was I interviewed Fern Renner Welk, who was Lawrence Welk's wife.
Yes.
She grew up south of Amanda, North Dakota, but she met Lawrence Welk at Yankton, South Dakota. She was studying at the Sacred Heart Nursing School. It was a Catholic nursing school in Yankton, which is now um, it's now Mount Marty College or Mount Marty University in Yankton. But I remember she told me in the interview that she met Lawrence Welk at when they would attend Sunday Mass, and she met Lawrence Welk in Yankton because he was performing on WNX radio, so he would go. But her girlfriends and so forth, when she met, she was kind of embarrassed to introduce him to some of the other girls because his English was very broken. It was very
Yeah.
limited,
Hmm.
even at that time.
Yeah.
So she would. I think she told me. She said, "Lawrence, when we meet for go for breakfast or lunch or something after church, you come later, and then sit. Don't sit with me at church. I'll meet you later." Because I think it was partly because most of the her girlfriends and other classmates were they were not German Russian or they knew the English language well. So
Hmm.
that was interesting, and that's how they met. And they actually got married at Yankton, South Dakota. I've actually seen the home where he was, where they purchased a small home, but that's how they developed. But what was so interesting was that Fern told me in her interview when I did the interview in Santa Monica, California, that she told me that she went home for one of the school breaks, and her mother told her, who was a widow lady, the father died young, so she had to raise all these children alone on the farm near St. Anthony, North Dakota. She said, "Whatever you do, Fern, don't marry a salesman or a musician because they're going to be on the road all the time,
Uh,
and that's not the best life for you."
yeah.
So she was when she did marry Lawrence and brought him home. She was very concerned about what she's going to tell her mother, and she told her mother he's a musician.
Yeah.
And then she said, "Well, we'll see." In German, I think she probably told her that, "Well, make the best of it."
Uh-huh.
But that's an interesting. But Fern actually said that because Fern was a well-educated woman with
Mhm.
a 3-year nursing degree, which is very unusual in the 1920s
Yeah. Yeah.
to do that.
Mhm.
Coming from a farm in North Dakota. So that was a real interesting story. And then so so it's become in the new biography, it's going to become quite noticeable that Fern had not an easy life with Lawrence because she pretty much was a single mother
Yeah.
raising 3 children, especially in Chicago in the
Hmm.
1930s and 40s until they moved to California because he was on the road all the time.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
example, it mentions in there that, for example, Shirley, who's the oldest of the children, who's I think 92, still living in Los Angeles area, she mentioned because each chapter Lance would send each chapter of the book to Shirley in
Oh,
California to read it and
awesome.
improve it.
Yeah.
Because there was some difficult times in the life, and
Yeah.
then the chapter would come to myself, to Jerry Klein Jr., who was a nephew to Johnny Klein on the Lawrence Welk Show, and to Father Thomas Welk, who was quite an authority genealogist on the Welk family. So they would read it, but Fern would get to see, or excuse me, Shirley would read these chapters. So she left a lot in there. I was surprised that she did. And it does include about the life in Chicago, because, for example, Lawrence Welk was on the road, I believe, when Shirley graduated from high school.
Hmm.
Well, you never let that happen as a father, not being at home for graduation or for a prom, but he
Yeah.
was on the road all the time. So
Yeah.
Fern had to be alone a lot. And then once they got to California in the 1950s, when he started playing on the local TV station and then finally on ABC, then they were living together.
Yeah.
So
So he was working closer to home. He didn't have to
closer
travel.
to home,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Well,
so
that's
that
when
becomes a
TV
little
took
apparent.
off. So everyone had access to him, so he didn't have to travel.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And so it's example there in California. I remember reading the chapters in the book that people wonder, how did the Lennon sisters get on the Lawrence Welk show?
Mm.
That's very interesting because the Lennon sisters are still active. They have a very active Facebook, and they live in Branson, Missouri. I think three of the four sisters live in Branson. Anyway, that developed because Lawrence Welk Jr., Larry Welk Jr., and was attending Santa Monica Catholic High School in
Okay.
California, and that's where they were living, either Santa Monica or another suburb.
Yeah.
And so one time, the Len sisters would perform at the school. It's probably some of the school events, and so
Hmm.
he finally convinced Lawrence, his father, that that let them audition. So what happened was, I believe that the Len sisters, came home to the Welk home, and Lawrence Welk heard them perform. And he
Uh-huh.
said, "Oh, they're not that bad," or whatever.
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
gave them a chance just as a tryout. So they were on the Lawrence Welk show. And they were such a hit on the Lawrence Welk show then then he kept them on the show for some more shows. And of course, they became very famous, and then they went on their show. But there was some tension between the Welks, the Lennon sisters, and Lawrence Welk, because Lawrence Welk was very persistent that the salaries of the entertainers was the union salaries, like the musicians union salaries.
Hmm.
So they felt they should get a higher salary because they were so famous. So then they went on their own,
Mm.
and later on everything turned out fine. But so that's why the Lennon sisters left the show, because they felt that they could be famous on their own, and then they developed their own shows. And then later on, though, they did gather together when the Lawrence Welk Theater opened in Branson, Missouri. Then they would perform. I think three of the four would perform there
Mm-hmm.
at Branson. Now, all of Lawrence Welk's properties, including the Lawrence Welk Theater, everything's been sold to Marriott.
Oh, yeah.
But we have, fortunately, the um, the theater at Branson had many in their lobby. They had many important photographs in the life of Lawrence Welk and the music group. But through the family, again, that's all been donated to the Friends of the Welk Homestead.
Oh,
We have this
fantastic.
invaluable collection of photographs that are framed. They're gold records that he performed, like "O Calcutta" and some of his famous records. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of different musics, and he's got some really famous people, like Perry Como and Kate Smith and all these famous people, Andy Williams and all these famous entertainers. So a lot of those are frames of his with him, and so we have all that. And fortunately, hopefully someday we'll be able to display some of this at the State Historical Society in Bismarck, or at um, at the Welk Homestead.
Mm-hmm.
In 19 Lawrence Welk died in 1992, and then working with with Shirley, the oldest daughter, I worked with her and the president of the university and NDSU. Then all of the Lawrence Welk collection came to NDSU. So we have now the Lawrence Welk collection at the North Dakota State University Archives. We
Right.
the actual, all the videos of the shows, I believe they're all at Oklahoma Public Television,
Oh,
because they're the ones who do the rebroadcasting of the PBS shows.
Mm-hmm.
But we have all the scrapbooks and a lot of the memorabilia and some of that. So that all and that's been especially the scrapbooks were very valuable for Dr. Ritchie in in developing this 3 volume set. See, what happened was, originally the book was supposed to be one book, and because it was such an important story, he it got so long, and he's had to do some editing and so forth. So it's but now fortunately, through the Friends of the Welk Homestead and through the state of North Dakota, we provided some underwriting funding. So it's going to be a 3 volume set. It'll be in a nice case. So that's going to be
Wow.
quite nice.
Can't wait to see that. That should be
Yeah, it's
really.
going to be very interesting. Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to that. And of course, there are going to be many, many photographs because Lawrence had a tremendous uh, photo files in
Mm-hmm.
the archives that
Mm-hmm.
people have here. We have the State Historical Society of Bismarck, the Welk collection here at NDSU, and then the family itself has a lot of photographs. You can imagine what he shows. And then there's also relating to Mr. Welk, he once had and that's been sold to Marriott also, but at Escondido, California, there was called the Lawrence Welk Resort, but
Okay.
it's been changed to call it's two golf courses and a lot of it's time sharing. But anyway, that's now called the Welk. But fortunately, the theater and the Welk exhibit or the museum there, the exhibits are still standing there. Fortunately, they're still standing. And there's also there at the Welk, there's also a bronze statue. So we don't know what's going to happen to that in the future. But I've seen the exhibit. It's a beautiful exhibit about the life of Lawrence Welk. It includes it includes the original um, certificate of in 1965 when Lawrence Welk received an honorary doctorate at North Dakota State University. They have that framed there. So I'm hoping that that'll all be saved. And so I asked John Fredericks, the grandson, who was very interested in history, I said, what's going to happen to all this someday? And he said that all the items from that exhibit at Escondido at the Welk Resort is still the property of the family.
Oh, good.
So he said that if something should happen, he'd be interested. They would certainly consider it should come to the State Historical Society of North Dakota because
Mm-hmm.
it's some really extremely valuable pieces in that exhibit.
Yeah. Now you mentioned some scrapbooks. Were those personal family scrapbooks that you're
Well,
saying?
it's very interesting. The scrapbooks were kept, by the staff of Lawrence Welk. So the scrapbooks were like Associated Press articles when he'd be entertaining, um, different places, and also it's interesting that a number of the scrapbooks, what would happen is um, Lawrence Welk's youngest sister, Eva, never married. She lived in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and she lived a very simple life. I interviewed her too. We have an interview of her, an audio interview. But what would happen is the staff, Agnes McGeehan, who was the one of the last secretaries, and then Margaret Heron, would send items they would get of newspaper articles and from magazine articles and so forth. They would send those articles and all these pieces to Fern in Aberdeen, South Dakota. And she'd put together these scrapbooks. So
Ah.
some of it was done by her because I remember seeing some of that when I interviewed her. So I understand that she did a number of the scrapbooks, and there's a number of scrapbooks, and it's just amazing what's in there. And a lot of it is articles from performances in New York, Chicago, um, you know, articles from TV Guide, and all these kinds of things are in there. So they're really valuable. Unfortunately, in the Lawrence Welk collection, we do not have much of the correspondence.
Mm.
I wish we had, for example, Lawrence Welk would write to his sisters in Strasbourg, and a lot of that was not saved. I wish that would have been saved because I've seen a lot of those letters, and I would get some of these letters too, and so that's all been added. So we've added some things from other people who have donated, and then also in the collection at NDSU, we've been trying to collect all of the record albums. He's got 45s and Lawrenceville goes back to the Long Plain records all the way back to the current, and a lot of this is they're still continuing to do that. But he would make ashtrays. He would make all kinds of. He was a real entrepreneur. So Lawrenceville, his wealth really was not so much from the television show, but his real estate. He became a real entrepreneur. At one time, he was the wealthiest, entertainer in America.
Oh, wow. Didn't know that.
And then now a lot of that, the property in Branson and in Escondido and other locations, that's all been sold now to Marriott.
Mm.
But the memorabilia and the items for a museum, that's all been kept by the family. Unfortunately, I think most of that's going to come to North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
Back home, you could say back home to North Dakota.
Yes. Yeah, to the roots.
But relating to his German Russian heritage, in the first books, for example, the book Wonderful, Wonderful, and his other biographies, it does not, it does, there's some inaccuracy or errors in there. It does not include that he was Germans from Russia.
Oh,
For instance, in Wonderful, Wonderful, it mentions that his ancestors came from Alsace, France. And so, of course, when it starts with one book and then other authors use the
right.
same book as a reference, so it
Mm-hmm.
continued. So fortunately, in the new 3-volume set, the new biography, Finding Lance is really going to emphasize his heritage to North Dakota and German Russian roots.
Mm-hmm.
Tells him where he came from the
Yeah.
village of Sels, near
Mm-hmm.
Odessa, Ukraine today, and so forth. And I think that's very important
Yeah, yeah.
because we
Yeah,
need, we need to know accuracy.
when I was doing my little research for my multi-person episode that I did, I found that too. The people that I was looking up, it was really hard to find that noted that they were actually, Germans from Russia. I actually went on census records and dug back in their family to find, where they actually did come from. I had to do that myself. It wasn't on the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, no, that's important because I know we here at North Dakota State University, on our website, we have the notable Germans from Russia, and then we recognize in Germans from Russia who are scholars. And I'm just working on in fact, I was working today, this morning, on one of my monthly columns one column is going to be on notable Germans from Russia, like John Denver, Lawrence
Yes,
Welk,
yeah,
Angie Dickinson, and people like that.
yeah,
And then the other one is going to be recognizing Germans from Russia in the scholarly fashion, like Dr. Joseph Haidt, Dr. Adam Giesinger, Emma Schwona Haynes, and all
yeah.
those kind of people. I'm working on that right now before we're
Awesome.
visiting this morning. So
Great.
it's really important. But
Hmm.
I'm I some of the items I'm trying to find, because sometimes it's not always accurate what's on Google. So I have to find the dates and what were the ancestral villages, if they were Volga German, Black Sea German from the Crimea, and so forth.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And of course, there are many of these famous Germans from Russia have roots to the Fresno Lodi area.
Yeah. Hmm.
And
Yep.
you've worked on some of that. So you can help us in identifying. And when we're not online, I'll send you the link to what's there now and if there are any other Germans from Russia that we should consider. We only do, for the Germans from Russia, notable Germans from Russia that we have on our website for the GRHC, it's only if they're from Canada or from the United States, not from other countries.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that would
Well,
get.
we are right on time to finish this off. I want to
Oh
let
my, it's that
know.
time already.
Yes. We can post, I will add all the links to all the things you mentioned, how to find the Prairie Public documentaries, how to find the biography, all those things. I will link those in my show notes. And thank you so much, Michael, for sitting down with me today. I look forward to speaking to you again soon and hopefully seeing you in Lincoln in July.
Right. And what I could end with say, wonderful, wonderful, like Lawrence Welk would say. Bye bye.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to the Germans from Russia experience. I hope that something you heard today will inspire you to learn anything and everything you can about your ancestors. If you like what you heard, please leave a review, like, and share this podcast. You can comment directly by emailing me at thegermansfromrussiaexp@gmail.com. Also, like my Facebook page, the Germans from Russia Experience Podcast. Please see my show notes for website suggestions to begin or continue your discovery of your Germans from Russia roots and about this episode. My podcast artwork is by Matt Wall. I received technical assistance from my friend, Annie Anderson.